Okay. So, right, page 1533. Okay, fine. So, yeah, as I said, that this is in terms of, I start from here, post-colonial theory. I'm not going to go to the background. Remember the last class before जो आपकी थी उसमें मैंने explained in detail what colonialism, post-colonialism is और उसकी impact theory पे कैसे how post-colonial translation theory evolved हुई. That was all everything which we did, you know. उसको डिटेल में कर चुके हैं, so we're not going to go back on that topic again. Today I'm going to slightly touch upon post translation theory, how it evolved, and what was in particular the role of Spivak. Why we are talking about post-colonial translation theory in context of Spivak? Because you see, colonialism was an era for 2 centuries. It was not specific to the Indian subcontinent, as I explained earlier. कि European powers, including England and France, and England and France, and then there was Portuguese, the Italians, they colonized different parts of the world. In particular, the Indian subcontinent was colonized by the British. इसी तरह Sri Lanka was colonized by Britain. Similarly, Malaysia and Singapore and Hong Kong, they were colonized by Britain, whereas Indonesia was colonized by Portuguese. And we move on to Africa. Africa में बहुत से मुल्क हैं जिनमें नाइजीरिया है, उनको ब्रिटिश ने colonized किया, but there were other countries like Libya was colonized by some other, and then we talk about Algeria, which was colonized by France. So, different colonizing powers. But for us, when we talk about post-colonial, in particular the context of Pakistan, तो हम उसको relate करते हैं with British, with British as the colonizing power, and their impact upon the Indian subcontinent before it was divided into India and Pakistan in 1947. That is the previous century. So, in this post-colonial translation theory, I'm talking in terms of what the contribution of, in particular, Indian writers, translators, Bengali critic and translator Spivak. Gyati Chivak Spivak was an important, prominent name. So, it's her contribution in terms of when she talks about post-colonial theory and what it moves on. So, in a one very famous book, she basically highlights concerns about the ideological. Spivak, as I said, she's a theorist and a translator as well, and she's a Bengali, Indian Bengali. So she's in particular, she talks about, she has a concerns about the ideological concerns of translation of third world country literature. She and other theorists felt that why is it that literature which was written in former colonies, which were colonized by Britain, or now that these countries have become independent countries, if the creative minds come up with writing, they write something, तो उसको हम लिटरेचर को ब्रांड कर देते हैं थर्ड वर्ल्ड लिटरेचर. We brand it as third world literature into English, and as giving this tag that this is something inferior. So Spivak has addressed these questions in particular in her seminal essay, The Politics of Translation, and which was written initially in 1993, and then there was a year 2000 revised version. She brings together feminists, post-colonialists, and post-structure. She brings these two approaches. As I said, Spivak was a great name. As a theorist, she addresses these questions and the politics of translation. She brings together, talks about these issues of feminist and post-colonialism and post-structuralist approaches. And she talks about the tensions between the different approaches which are highlighted. With Spivak, she speaks against Western feminists. You expect feminist writing, somehow then she brings another issue that the feminism, as it said, as you know, this debate about feminism, this issues feminism. She says that in particular, feminist writers, they are considered like marginalized in their own country. Similarly, says that when Spivak is speaking about Western feminists, who expect when these feminist writings from former colonies, say Indian feminist writers or Pakistani feminist writers, if they come up and they write something in their own native languages, and then they get it translated in Europe into English or other languages of power or hegemonic languages of power, said should I say French or English, what happens is that somehow it is always considered by Western feminists as if this is something inferior. So this is, she takes exception to this. She is critical about this, that why these Western feminists, they expects that feminist writings which are originating from the subcontinent, from outside Europe, कि वो एक inferior quality हैं, and they've been translated into language of power. So such translations in Spivak's view, they're often expressed in transnationese, and she eliminates the identity of politically less powerful individuals and cultures. And then she says that in the act of wholesale translation into English, there can be betrayal of the democratic ideal into the law of the strongest. This happens when all the literature of the third world gets translated into sort of they translate so that the literature by women and then in particular she was critical that why is it that literature which was actually written in a source language it's translated it into English language, and when it it is translated, this tag goes with it that it's literature belongs to the third world, it is translated, and then उसको ऐसे translate किया जाए that it's almost you're almost rewriting, you have rewritten it, and it is almost that when it appears that it's by, although it's written by a woman, but it appears as if it's a kind of a prose and written by a man in Taiwan. So कोई identity, कोई closeness नहीं. That is the way it has been so much the translated has been so much, should I say, rewritten, so much change that it doesn't show that if the translation actually was written by a woman in Palestine, उसको जब translation के process से गुजर के इतना modify किया करे, it looked like as if it's prose and it's written by a man who is in Taiwan. So Spivak was critical of this Western feminism, and she takes a very biting exception that feminists from the hegemonic countries show real solidarity with, and she's very critical about is that why these women in post-colonial, they show solidarity with women in post-colonial context by learning the language in which those women speak and write. In Spivak's opinion, the politics of translation currently gives prominence in English. And so, in Spivak's opinion, the politics of translation it currently gives importance to English and the other hegemonic languages of ex-colonization. So translation into all of these languages, from Bengali, they often fail to translate the difference of Bengali view because the translator, albeit with good. And then, in particular, Spivak is critical that even translation works were actually written in Indian languages, Bengali or Hindi. When they are translated, even with good intention, the translator like over assimilates, makes it change when it is translated so that it's accessible and acceptable to the Western reader. उसको ऐसे modify करेंगे, it over assimilated, making it accessible to the Western readers. And Spivak's own translation strategy also necessitates the translators intimately understanding the language and situation of the original. And then it draws also on the post-structuralist concept of rhetoric, logic, and social and all that. Then Spivak his work is indicative of how cultural studies and especially post-colonialism has over the past decade focused on issues of them. So she moves on, and in particular, she's critical. She talks in terms of cultural studies and excuse me, talks about the past decade on the issues of translation, and then within translation, she links it with the idea of she says that translation is not simple translation, it is like transnationalism. From the way translation, it's not simply translating from one source text to another, it's like changing the text which is written in a different nation, in a different country, with country obviously with people having their own nationality, and when it is translated into the target text for the target audience who belong to a different nationality, that means is, and with nationality obviously comes the difference of culture and other values and other things, and then on top of it the idea of colonization. So she says that some of these ideas are interrelated, transnationalism and colonization. So she links of colonization and translation is, she accompanies it by the argument that translation has played an active role in colonization process, although she says she gives credit to this, that translation is important and it has always played an important role in the colonization process, and it also in disseminating ideologically motivated image of colonized people. And then, just as in the previous section, there was a parallel between feminist theorists I've just talked about and drawn between conventional male-driven depiction that is always considered the feminist theorists, what do they talk about, and when it's male-driven depiction of translations of women. So this metaphor has to be used for similar, this metaphor is kind of used in the same context that women from the colonial world, even feminist writers, we always talk of it as if they are marginalized in terms of a male-driven depiction of translation and considered that somebody wants to join, and then and then she talked about is the parallels between feminist and conventional male-driven translation, and also has the metaphor been used by colony. It is used as an imitative and inferior. उसको colony को use करेंगे as an imitative and inferior translational translation copy of about it. Okay, then this is so that the metaphor being used by the colony as an imitative and inferior translational copy whose suppressed identity has been overwritten by the colonizer. So colonizer's role is, is in such ideological images which led Besnet and Trivedi so much so is that the way it is the the process of colonization or in the post-colonial era as well, the way even translation from source text to the target text, source text from a previous colony, former colony, and written by writers in the former colony, and even translated by the people from that particular post-colonial country. They are kind of under this influence of this hegemonic power relationship, and it is like so much so that it's like when they're translating is it's like almost like overwriting. What the colonized people are doing it that they're overwriting उसको इतना transform कर रहे हैं source text से, so that it is acceptable to the colonizer, to the Western power, the seats of power in the hegemonic, and to please their hegemony. So, in particular, Besnet and Travidi, they are against these ideological images, and they in their book basically say that it's a very shameful trend that the way translation theory or translation studies is moving to, that even the era of colonialism has still the impact upon the translation, the way it has been conducted by, written by former people from the former colonies and translated by people from former colonies. But since they're translated for the colonizers, the hegemonic powers, so it is like a shameful history of translation जिसमें आप उसको इतना modify करें source text is so that it is acceptable in the seats of power. So in particular, Besant and Kavidi are critical, and they say that it's a shameful history of translation. Then we move on, and there's the central transaction of translation studies and post-colonial theory, and we talk about the idea of power relation. So Tejaswani Niranjana's translation history, post-structuralism, and the colonial context, it all presents an image of the post-colonial as still scored through by an absentee colonialism. So we move on and we look at this Niranjana's sitting translation and history and post-colonial and post-context world. There's an image of the post-colonial world as still it is scored through an absentee. We say that even what to say is that even what is happening in the field of translation, according to Niranjana, is that it seems that as if this translation is still under the influence of an absentee colonialism. Though colonialism is over, the era of colonialism is over, but there's still so much impact of the former colonizers कि अभी तक वो even this discourse, the way it is translation is coming up, is still under the impression, is still under the influence of absentee colonial powers or colonialism कि वो अभी तक ऐसे उसको modify किया जा रहा है source text को to be presented to the seats of power, to the to the Western readers who will be reading the beneficiaries of the soul of the target text. So she sees literary translation as one of the discourses, the others being education, theology, historiography, and philosophy, which inform the hegemonic apparatuses that belong to the ideological structure of colonial rule. So, in particular, Niranjana she moves on and then she says that it is shameful that it's not only literally translation जिसको कि आप source text को या novels या short stories को आप translate कर रहे source text को target text में, it is in other disciplines as well. Other disciplines like what? Education की field में देखें जैसे translation हो रही है, theology है, that is religion, then historiography from the word history, okay, and philosophy. So that's even all these different fields. एजुकेशन ले लें, थियोलॉजी, हिस्ट्री, इन सब फिलोसफी में which inform, although these are independent disciplines, but in पे भी impact of colonialism है. They, because when they are translated, somebody wants to join from source text to target, because they inform the hegemonic apparatus which belong to the ideological structure of colonial power, because when they are being translated, they are being translated for these seats of power. So what happens is that it is like the way उसको translate कर रहे हैं, even these disciplines are under the influence of the hegemonic powers. So let me give you the example in particular of historiography, middle of this paragraph. You are all aware that the word historiography is from the word history. Okay. Now let me give you a pertinent example that history, is a subject which is based on facts. Like you and we have all read history based on the historical facts. Okay, and this is one discipline, one subject which has to stay true to the truthful, to the honest, documentation of facts. उसको कोई आप emotions या subjective नहीं quote नहीं करते. It has to be in a very very factual manner. It has to be documented. But what happens is you'll be surprised to see that the hegemonic powers also influence that. Okay, let me tell you how. Now you're all aware. Now give me 1 minute. I want to drink water. Now you're all aware that the Indian subcontinent was colonized by Britain. Okay, and for 200 years, the Indian subcontinent was colonized by Britain, जिसको ब्रिटिश राज का आप यूज किया करते हैं और ब्रिटिश इंडिया के वर्ड यूज करते हैं. So in that particular area, that era, the history of that particular era, say about 2 centuries, um, that history, which is written by the local writers, say पाकिस्तानी इंडियन जो historians हैं, वो एक अपने perspective से उसको document करते हैं और history को लिखते हैं. You and I, we have read the same history, which is written from a local perspective, from Pakistani and Indian writers, and the way it is presented historical fact. We have come through that history of that era from our historians who have documented history for us. Okay. Now, the same era of history, which is when the British were here, when they wrote history about their 200 years rule in the subcontinent, they obviously wrote it from their own perspective. So when they wrote it from their own perspective, we say that it was like Eurocentric perspective. Whatever they wrote about the history of 200 years of rule in the subcontinent, उसको उन्होंने अपने Eurocentric perspective से उसको quote किया और इन events और उनको modify भी किया है the way which pleased them according to their hegemonic apparatus, their जो उनको अपील करता था. That's right. उनके अपने perspective होंगे. But let me just give you one very prominent historical event. You're all aware of 1857 की जिसको War of Independence कहते हैं. You're aware of it, isn't it? So जिसको जंग आज़ादी 1857 के नाम से किया जाता है. And how when the British were here, initially Pakistan, Muslim and Hindus reacted to it, and that is led to that that was their effort on their part. In the Indians in the army and Muslims in the army, I mean Hindus, how they reacted, they did take place. So, but the aftermath of that 1857, what it was that eventually the British entrenched fully into the subcontinent, and then they became the supreme power, and they became the colonizing power, and they became the imperial rulers of the subcontinent. So when they write history of that event, 1857, they have documented it from their own perspective. वो उसको rebellion कहते हैं, the war of rebellion. They say that it was like rebellion, the way the Indians, Muslims and Hindus rebelled against the British, and we says it's a war of independence. तो आप देखिए एक event की जो title है वो ही different perspective से. The Indian, Pakistani Muslims, we say war of independence, और वो क्या कह रही है? It was the like a rebellion. They, as if the soldiers from Hindus and Muslims, they rebelled against the British. Okay, so I hope it makes sense to you that this is what I'm saying is कि वो translation सिर्फ literary translations को नहीं modify किया गया for to please the Western powers. Even other discourses, other subjects like education, theology, historiography, और फिलोसफी को भी ऐसे चेंज करके प्रेजेंट किया जाता है फॉर द वेस्टर्न पावर्स so that which it appeals to them, it appeals to the hegemonic, it appeals to, so because obviously the people who are writing in the third world want to get their work published in the west, तो इसलिए उनको वही dictates follow करनी पड़ेंगी what the hegemonic apparatuses in the west wants. Okay, so Niranjana's focuses on the way translation into English has generally been used by the colonial power and construct a rewritten image of the East that has been come to stand for the. So Niranjana says that this is on the way translation into English has generally been used by the colonizing power, and it's like this colonizing power has almost like they have rewritten an image of the East, history ko kiya, and they history has been come to stand for truth. Then they also give examples of the colonizers' imposition of ideological values. Then they gave up other examples of the colonizers, how they imposed it was, imposed their ideological values and other things. And they vary from missionaries who ran schools for the colonized and who also performed the role of linguists, translators, to ethnographers who recorded grammars of native languages. Okay, so it happens is that it was apart from the British the colonizer who colonized. We talk about the bureaucrats and the way, the length and breadth of India, how it was, brought under the British rule and in terms of everything, not only imposing the language, the legal system, and others, there were the governance and the bureaucracy. Everything was like, imported, and it was imposed on the people of the subcontinent. So surprisingly, even the missionaries, who set up different schools across the length and breadth of the Indian subcontinent, and the apparent aim was that they have established these English schools in the Indian subcontinent, so that they make the younger generation of Indians be educated, be informed to what Western education is. So they become aware of what the Western education is, Western education subjects kya hai, values kya hai, disciplines kya hai, and of course English language as was that. So apparently these missionaries who came up this under the face of this, this image, they have come to civilize the people, to educate them, to these colonized people. But they were actually, it is recorded that there were some other tasks as well in which they were operating. It was not simply a simple missionaries have come to run the schools. Another important aspect is that obviously they were tried to even inspire people जिनको convert कर सकते थे Christianity. Obviously they did try to convert some people, mostly Hindus, और उसमें ज़्यादा untouchable. So there's a lot of these lower class Hindus, they did became they converted and became Christians. But otherwise as well, apart from converting them, they became linguists. They started recording, as recording grammars of the people of the native, of the native people, the subcontinent, उनकी languages को record करने लग पड़े, their grammars, their ethnographers, their values, their culture. So there was so much to it that even these mission schools obviously had come this noble task of civilizing or educating the younger generation of the colonized people. They were involved in a number of, somebody wants to join, and others as well as ethnographers and recorders of grammar as well. So Niranjana sees all other groups as participating in the project of collection and codification. So in particular, Niranjana, she says that this is surprisingly everyone was involved, as was these missionaries. They were involved in participating in this enormous grand project जिसमें वो data collect कर रहे थे, codification कर रहे थे, on which the colonial power was based upon it. So they were trying to get the data of this of their Indian subcontinent, in terms of knowing about the people from different races of subcontinent, what different languages were the native languages in Indian subcontinent, and obviously religion or theology, हर चीज पे उनकी नजर थी. So she specifically attacks translation's role within. So when she looks at this from this perspective, overview देख रही है कि कैसे enormous project था Indian the colonizing power who came to India, to collect, collection of data, codification of colonial power. Why they wanted this codification? Because as rulers, they wanted to get information of the native people. So, in particular, Niranjana is critical. She says that why translation as a practice shapes and takes shapes within the asymmetrical relations of power that occur. She says that obviously, whether Britain or the British colonizing powers, there's this agenda, but there was no way that at least translation should have been independent. उसको as a independently काम करना चाहिए था. Why translation takes shape and within the asymmetrical relations of power it operates still under the process of colonialism. अभी तक उसका वही impact of why it's still under the process of colonial mindset that whatever is written even by the native writers of India, Hindu or Pakistani origin, why when that work is translated into English for the Western audience, तो वो impact of colonialism क्यों नहीं जाता? Why this impact of colonialism still them that they have to rewrite that original text? ऐसे उसको rewrite it, it's almost like इतना उसको transform करेंगे original text के so that it is acceptable in the Western world, the Western readers, the Western target text users or the readers. Okay, so this she feels, according to her, it's like the power of colonialism, which is still impact. It still has a very strong impact everywhere. Okay. Furthermore, she goes on to criticize translation studies itself for its Western. So which is very critical. Even she says about translation studies as well. She says that why translation studies itself for its largely Western orientation and for three main things she's resilient and she's critical of the discourse of or as a discipline translation studies that why it is when it's so much largely under the influence of Western orientation and under the three main failings that she sees result from. The number one is that translation studies has until recently not considered the question of power. Why is it? He says that people who are in the field of translation in post-colonial translators, why can't they see this imbalance between different languages? Why can't they see that why their own original language is considered inferior and why the language of the Western power, say English or other European languages, are considered superior? So why it is that they feel that why they can't these people understand its failings on their part, according to her, that is they're not considering the question of power imbalance between different languages. Then the second is that the concept underlying much of Western translation theory are flawed. Notion of text, author, meaning are based on an unproblematic. Then she's a further on. She says that much of the Western translation theory are these notions are flawed, and author, and there's unproblematic, naively representational theory of language. And then she says that the humanistic enterprise of translation needs to be questioned that since translation in the colonial context builds a conceptual image of colonial domination, and then it's why this under the humanistic enterprise of translation it needs to be questioned since translation in the colonial context is builds a conceptual image of colonial domination. That is, it's still the impact of colonial domination or its dominating influence on the discourse of Western philosophy. Then Niranjana writes from an overtly post-structuralist perspective, and the later forms of, when we look at chapter 3, chapter 10, we'll consider the influence of these, in particular Derrida. This overlapping is indicative of the interaction of different aspects of cultural studies and of the way in which they interface with translation studies. It informs Niranjana's recommendations. So Niranjana comes up with her own recommendation for the action. What are they? Number one is, in general, that the post-colonial translator must call into question every aspect. So she is critical, and the first thing she says is that the post-colonial translator must call into question every aspect. Is that the translator should not be that naive, should be aware of that what is the policy, underlying policy of translation or the people in the Western world. So must be aware of the underlying currents, what's happening. In general, that the post-colonial translator must call into question every aspect of colonialism to her and liberal nationalism. It must be aware. For Niranjana, this is not just a question of avoiding Western metaphysical representation, it's a case of dissonance. It is simply they have to understand that when they know what is the underlying policy, then they will be knowing that it's not simply वो avoid कर रहे हैं Western metaphysical representative translation. They should also be aware that it is when they are well aware of this hegemonic agenda, and should be ready to dismantle. Dismantle means कि उसको kind of crush it, dismantle the hegemonic West from within. They sh- Knowing that what's the inner policy of the hegemonic West, if they're aware of that this is the policy, इस वजह से this is why they want the translation to appeal to them, उसको rewriting it so much, making it so different from the source text. When they know this is a policy of the hegemonic West from within, then they will be reconstructing and identifying the means by which the West represses the North. And then they would be knowing that this is okay, this is the policy of the West. ये तो एक strategy है जो वो use कर रहे हैं repress करने के लिए non-West को, and to marginalize them as well into Joe Northern. In this way, such repression, at least once they know that what is the aim and objective of the West, जब वो इनको marginalize करते हैं, if they are aware it, at least they can react, they can rebel, they can counter. अगर ऐसी repression के लिए अगर आप mentally ready हैं, then you will be able to, translators should be able to repress, and they should also know how to counter this strategy, that not following each and every word of the hegemonic powers in terms of when they're carrying on the translation. Okay. Specifically, Niranjana calls for an interventionist approach from the translator. She particularly empowers, wants to empower the translator, और उसको कहती है कि उनमें एक ability होनी चाहिए to intervene as an interventionist. They should be able to intervene and follow this approach as a translation, as a translator. Then she says that I initiate here a practice of translation that is speculative, provisional, and it says that I basically talk about this practice of translation. जिसको उसको उसे speculative होना चाहिए, provisional or intervene phase. She proclaims in her analysis of translation of a spiritual Lucana poem from southern India, she attacks existing translations, and then she says, is it that gives examples of very prominent Indian writing, Indian जो religion से spiritual works हैं, Indian जो हिंदी में लिखे गए Wakana poems from southern. She basically attacks the existing translators who are translating it, and she attacks it that very so much so that very even celebrated known translators like A.K. Raman Juan, what they are trying to do is to simulate a simulate a Suwathi poetry to the discourse of Twitter. This is that why they are others so much influenced of the Western power that even trying to simulate even traditional, Hindi or religious poetry, उस डिस्कोर्स को ऐसा चेंज कर रहे हैं टू फिट इन अकॉर्डिंग टू द डिस्कोर्स ऑफ क्रिश्चियनिटी, पोस्ट रोमांटिक न्यू क्रिटिसिज्म को इतना ट्रांसफॉर्म कर रहे हैं, इतना चेंज कर रहे हैं दैट इवन अ स्पिरिचुअल थियोलॉजी और एक आपकी स्पिरिचुअल पोइट्री है उसको भी आप ऐसे ट्रांसफॉर्म कर रहे हैं दैट इट फिट्स इन अकॉर्डिंग टू द क्रिश्चियनिटी और न्यू क्रिटिसिज्म. So, Niranjana is not in favor of that because, according to her analysis of this, is she attacks this existing translation and obviously these renowned translators as well, big names like A.K. Ramanjan, that they should be able to cope with situation. So, analogous to 19th century native responses to colonialists, her own suggested translation resists the containment of the poet's work. So it says that her own suggested translation, according to her, she resists this idea of containment of colonial discourse. कि जो colonial discourse है, उसको ऐसे आप under control करें, जो which is emanating from the former colonies, उसको ऐसे control, contain किया जाए amongst other things, like reinforcing the name of the poet's god, Goswara and Lenga. Even you're changing the names of Hindu gods like Goswara, Lenga, or उनको representation of light, or even avoiding the similes and native form or metaphors भी नहीं आप उनके use करें. You're avoiding the similes and you're avoiding the metaphors. So that should be the case. She said that you should avoid similes, you should avoid all these metaphors and all this, and you should not feel that it should translation should resist or the containment और उसको contain करके आप colonial discourse में इस तरीके से डाल दें. That is कि even names of gods have also been changed. So she is not in favor of that. So asymmetrical power relations in a post-colonial context form the thread of. So later on, as we move on that how this post-colonial theory is evolving, we move on and look at some other important works in post-colonial context. This is a collection of essays titled Post-Colonial Translation Theory and Practice, and it's edited by Susan Besnett and Harish Travidi. Big names, Travidi and Besnett, they've done phenomenal good work. So in their introduction to this book, they said that these power relationships being played out in the unequal struggles of various local languages against the one master language of it. So he says that they are also very critical that why, according to Basin and Trivedi, that they've got this power relationship that even although India has a history of which a history of a country which is rich in different languages. You see कितनी नेटिव आप पाकिस्तान में देख लें कितनी लैंग्वेजेस आप चार सूबों की लैंग्वेजेस देख लें then we talk about other languages. This is a world, Indian subcontinental language, an era which is, rich, has a rich background of languages. This is that why is it that an area, subcontinent, which already has a history of, of having the history of various local languages and well-developed languages, not simple, well-developed written languages, जिसमें literature लिखा गया है. Why is it that still unequal relationships? Because that हिंदी में अगर कोई poetry लिखती है religion के बारे में जब उसको when it's translated into English, into the post-colonial world into English, why is it that these translators have to come up with strategy कि उसको इतना transform किया जाए translation में that it's almost like rewriting, totally change कर दें आप उसको. So translation is thus seen as a battleground. So according to these writers, Besnet and Trivedi, they see this translation is not simply translation from source text to target, it's like a battleground. Why she's used this word battleground? That means that the people who are involved to take it in this strategy, that when you know that what is your plus points as a translator of your own a text from say Pakistani translator translating the Pakistani text, you know that what is something good, the specific cultural values, ideas, language के perspective जो उर्दू language के हैं जो आप retain करना चाहेंगे when you're going to translate it, at least you're not going to modify it so much that it doesn't show that from which particular nation or which country or from which language it's coming. So exemplification of post-colonial context, there's a close linkage of translational to transnational. So she moves on and she says that let's not forget that translation is not, it's obviously it's a battleground. And then you've also to see that there's a strong relationship between translational from the word translation to translation. It means translating from one language to another, but it's also like transnational. Why transnational? Because each country has its own language. Like if we say that Urdu text hai from Pakistan, written by Pakistani writer, it needs to be translated into English language. So you have to see that apart from simple translation, it is also transnational. Why? Because this text, which is written in Urdu by a Pakistani writer, Pakistan has its own distinct identity. It's a एक नेशन है, एक डिस्टिंक्ट आइडेंटिटी एज ए नेशन, एक अपनी कल्चरल वैल्यूज हैं जिसके बैकग्राउंड जिसके सिनेरियो में बैकड्रॉप में these writers are writing. And similarly the translators who also happen to be Pakistani translators, when they're translators, they again have they own their own distinct identity as Pakistani translators. So when they're translating it, if they have to keep in mind कि ये दो ट्रांसलेशन सिंपल ट्रांसलेशन नहीं है, इट इज ट्रांसनेशनल भी है कि आपने ये जो नेशन से रिलेटेड इश्यूज हैं डिस्टिंक्ट आइडेंटिटी उसको कैसे रिटेन करें. द लेटर टर्म रेफरिंग बोथ to the post-colonial living between nations as immigrants and example. Then he moves on and talks about it. When he talks about transnational, we look about other writers and we look about other people and talks about, one thing is that post-colonial people who are living in their own country, that's different. When they present or write about it, but other people like actually from Indian origin or Hindus or Muslims as well who have moved on as diaspora into other parts, into the regions, say in England. The example is Salman Rushdie, you're all aware that he's an Indian writer, Indian Muslim writer, but he's based in UK. But what he does it, then obviously when he's writing as an immigrant, in that is totally different. It's more widely it's like a locational disruptor. Why it's a locational disruptor? Because once you're based in your own soil, when you're based in your own soil, you're as a nation, as a country, you have your roots deeply entrenched in your own land, in your in your own native land, should I say. But a person like Salman Rushdie, who's uprooted, who has moved from here and moved on and settled as an immigrant in UK, doesn't have this, it faces this locational disruption because uska ab is location, is soil se koi ताल्लुक nahi hai. So that is kind of the situation of those who remain. And naturally, when he writes about, like satanic verses or something like that, is because he has this dislocational disruption and he's not close to his roots, to his culture, to his values, to his religion, and he can come up with those types of writing. And similarly, he says the others who are writing in their own country, they are still living in the melting pot of their native site, so they are careful when in terms of translation as well. So in the current theoretical discourse, and to speak of post-colonial translation is a little bit of tautology. In our age of valorization of migrancy, exile, and diaspora, the word translation seems to become full circle and diverted from its figurative literal meaning of an interlingual transaction to economic. So when we look about this as we speak of post-colonial translation, when we talk about this idea of migrancy and exile and diaspora, and the word translation, we see it comes as a full circle, and we look at it is not simply a literal meaning of an interlingual translation, it's etymological, physical, and we talk about locational disruption and all that. So post-colonial studies takes many different forms, as has been studied by Besnett and Trabidi and other theorists in their book. And then several are based on the theory and practice of translation from an Indian perspective. So, according to Besnett and Trabidi, several of these theory and practice, they are based from an Indian perspective, Indian literary traditions and are essentially traditions of its own traditions. Indians, they have their own traditions of translation, says Devi, and their studies of work is celebrated. Then he talks of celebrated writers like V.K. Raman and then A.K. Ramanjuan. But in the later case, he reacts again Narayan's attack on Ramanujan, stating that Ramanujan has worked from an earlier and different version of the poem that ignores Niranjan ignores the translator's commentary on the poem. Then, as it is, Niranjana is with attacks and gives critical, stating that Ramanujan has worked from an earlier and different version of the poem. Then she ignores the translator's commentary on the poem, and that the goal of translation was to orient the Western reader to cross-cultural similarities. Okay. So now I'm just going to move on to Brazilian cannibalism and explain to you in the next 10 to 15 minutes. Remember this, what I talked about the era of colonialism. We basically talk about the area of colonialism in context of the Indian subcontinent. This whole the previous post-colonial theory was based in the backdrop of the post-colonial era when Britain colonized the Indian subcontinent, and we talk about what happened to that. History का भी मैंने वो example दिया था 1857 war of how it is done, even history को कैसे distort किया गया in terms distort, or then the historiography be written from the who documented Europeans from Eurocentric perspective, जिन्होंने इंडिया का लिखा हुआ इंडियोसेंट्रिक perspective अपने perspective से उन्होंने हिस्ट्री को रिपोर्ट किया, although history is a discipline which is based on facts, okay? Facts and only facts. Okay, so coming to Brazilian cannibalism, it means that is, as I said, that it was not only Indian and subcontinent was colonized. Other in that era, different parts of the world were colonized by different colonizing powers. Now we move on to what was happening in South America. As you know, in South America, Brazil and other countries, they were colonized by Spanish and other Spaniards. And what was impact upon them, and what do they what is their concept, I should say, in terms of this uh, you know this theory of translation. So another important post-colonial movement in translation has come from Brazil. It is based on the metaphor of anthropophobia or cannibalism, which emerged in 1920s with Oswald de Andrade's manifesto, drawing on the famous story of the ritual cannibalization of a Portuguese bishop by native, and it is based on actually historical fact of how ritual cannibalism of a Portuguese bishop was made by native Brazilians. From 1960s, and with the political form of the D. Gama brothers, the metaphor has been used by the strong Brazilian translation studies community to stand for the experience of colonization and translation. And the colonizers and the language are devoured, their life force invigorating the divorce, but a new purified and energized form that is appropriate to the needs of the native people. He talks about is that in Brazil, in terms of is that how the colonizer and the language, they devoured, when they came, the colonizer for them, as I said, Spain was the colonizing power. They came up, they devoured the language of the native people, their life force, and in a new purified, energized form, they started appropriating and changing to the needs of the people of the native language. So if you look at the summary of Brazilian cannibalism movement and we say that what does it mean? ये cannibalism की जब भी बात हो रही है, maybe you're aware of this term cannibalism. Simply, it's a metaphor, actually drawn from the native ritual whereby feeding from someone or drinking. Yeah, this is in Africa and parts of South America. This tradition or this tradition of, we call this as a metaphor cannibal. It is taken from the natives. उनकी rituals हैं, which means that you're feeding on somebody's blood or drinking someone's blood, that whereby you're feeding on someone or somebody or drinking somebody's blood. And this is did it as the part of the religion, as their totem tapper, that is part of their some religious rituals. They did it under this, okay. And this was a means of absorbing the other strength. The rationale for having this cannibalism was कि आप दूसरे से strength लेते हैं, you're absorbing the strength. And there's a pointer to the project. And then it talks about a group or to deny foreign influences or nourishment, but to absorb and draw strength from the tradition of autocrats, initially using the metaphor as an irrelevant verbal and its precedence. Okay, so this was in terms of we have come to the end of this, but once let me just wind up with one sentence in the word in the overt attempt at freeing Brazilian nature, yeah, culture from mental colonialism, the manifesto directs the flow of Eurocentric historiography of the New World by means of permanent. So much so it is that the same way I give you the historiography of Indian subcontinent, in the example of 1857, how it is, recorded with Eurocentric perspective from Britain. उन्होंने history books में लिखा है, totally different version है from the version historical fact which happened here and recorded by native Pakistani and Indian historians. Similarly, when we talk about the New World, जिसको अमेरिका और साउथ अमेरिका की बात हो रही है, the New World, by the means of permanent Keriba revolution, it becomes a source of revolution, changes the old world is pronounced and indebted to and they say that somehow the old world, it is indebted that the new world, because without it, who says Europe would not have its poor Declaration of Rights of Man when they came and they kind of colonized America as well. Okay, they colonized America and South America as well. Okay. So, class, with this, I've come to the end of today's lecture. If you have any questions, you can ask me now. Um, you know, because next week, inshallah, we'll have a class. Yes, आपकी Monday को भी होगी. We will be just a few three, four, pages of notes I've taken from the best next book, which are again related to the postcolonial. But then I'm planning to move on to the next topics, to, for this and course related. Okay. So any questions, class? Now it's open to questions now. Section B.